Well, good morning, Rouse Hill Bible Church. My name is Russ Matthews. For anybody who might be visiting for the first time online, we want to welcome you to today's service. I'm one of the regular speakers here and on the leadership team here at Rouse Hill Bible Church. Today we're continue to travel through the book of Philippians, and today's talk is called Joy During Isolation. I found it fascinating as I was going through to study this portion of the text, which you'll find there in Philippians 1 that was just read earlier. And where we are in the Bible is very similar to kind of some of the experiences that Paul was experiencing in isolation. This is a man who was in prison, and he was isolated from those that he loved and wanted to be with, but yet he found joy during this time. I find this really fascinating as we kind of travel through this and look at this portion of history as well as what we can understand and know of the Bible here today. So stay there with me in Philippians chapter 1, and we'll kind of look at what Paul's experience was, but also how it correlates with what our experience has been specifically during lockdown. So Paul wasn't able to be with his church family, but yet he was able to look around and see the opportunities that God had afforded him by being in prison, of all places, but yet he was able to be joyful. Kind of helped me to have a little bit of perspective when we kind of go through and experience what we are currently during lockdown. We're locked down, but yet we're still able to go out and get food. We're still able to go get exercise. We might have to wear masks in any certain place, but yet we still have so many freedoms. We are separated physically in so many ways, but yet we have the technology to be able to connect with one another. So despite being isolated, have we too looked at the opportunity that God has given us in this time of isolation to be able to further on the gospel? Well, today that's really what I'm hoping to be able to do, is we'll be able to go through and look at what Paul is saying about being in isolation and how he responds to that. See, Paul encourages the Philippians by pointing out that he's been in prison, but it's been provided opportunities to proclaim the gospel. If you continue to study through Philippians, you'll see that there is a bit of disunity going on within the church itself. And he's hoping to show them that he was able to find joy amid his difficult circumstances, that he was trying to be an example himself. But also that he'd been given certain things and certain opportunities, specifically that he was, even though he was in prison, he was able to entertain guests. I mean, there were so many different people coming in and talking with him, at least what we can understand from the history books. Two is that he was able to write letters to the churches. But most importantly, he was able to share the gospel to a new audience. He was able to share the gospel with confidence and without fear. I mean, honestly, it would have been easy for Paul to kind of wallow in his situation, wouldn't it? Complaining about the fact that he wasn't able to go and do the things that he was supposed to be doing in his life. He's an apostle. I mean, does he really need to suffer? Well, I think some of us actually wrongly think that Jesus suffered so that we don't have to suffer. But that, my friends, isn't biblical or accurate. Jesus plainly states in Matthew 10, 16 through 25, that if he suffered as a teacher, we would also suffer as his followers. Jesus does not promise to remove our suffering, but he promises to be with us throughout our suffering and give us power to overcome the situations in life and joy. So how are we supposed to respond during this time of our isolation? Well, if you're surprised by suffering or find yourself angry because of isolation, then it might be difficult for you to kind of endure faithfully. Your focus is completely wrong. See, when our eyes are fixed on Jesus, the one who loves us lavishly and gave himself up to suffer for us, then his grace is also sufficient to give us boldness and perseverance during this time of isolation. Something that Paul was able to see while he was writing, while he was imprisoned. A time of extreme isolation. See, not to spoil future talks, but we need to make sure we remember one of the key verses that comes out of Philippians. Because we need to remember that Christ is in us. As it says in Philippians 1:29, for you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for him. We are in this struggle together. So we can find joy during this time of isolation, just as Paul did. Even though he was separated, he still found joy and an opportunity to be able to serve the Lord. And he did this specifically by sharing the gospel. See, we need to realize that despite our current situation, the gospel will progress. And we just need to realize if we want to be a part of that whole process or not. As it says in verse 14, and most of the brothers, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Over the past few weeks, one of the things I've enjoyed doing is actually going through this one book that's these short biographies of key, prominent Christians throughout church history. It's been fascinating to go through and study, and I'd encourage it for anyone. But some of the things that really stood out to me throughout all of the different biographies that I've read is that I'm able to see kind of the ups and downs, the highs and the lows that all of them experienced. And though being mightily used by the Lord, every single one of them, they weren't necessarily guaranteed an easy life. Actually, many of them lived very difficult lives, and some of them even experienced horrific deaths. But yet, God still used him and was glorified in it. And the thing that I came away from after reading each one of them was that I was inspired to keep going myself. That I could have the perspective that I really haven't suffered that much in my personal life, but yet also that despite the suffering and the things that we might experience, is that we should have the will to keep going. This is true for Paul also. For him and others, that they were inspired by him being imprisoned. The word Paul uses for the advancement of the gospel is the same one that's in verse 25. It really means the progression in faith. Christians should seek to advance God's kingdom rather than dwelling in our past and our present problems. Once again, proving that persecution and confinement are ineffective means of stopping the gospel. Paul's imprisonment emboldened him and also emboldened other Christians to be able to go through and share their faith. And so during this time, and one of the things I would really encourage you to do, and what was really kind of came to me from this word, is one, we need to be preaching the gospel. But first, we need to go through and preach the gospel to ourselves. That's not being selfish, that just means to kind of fill the tank, as it were. I have a feeling that many of you during isolation really need to spend some time with God. Spend some time with Jesus, reintroducing yourself to him in a way, rediscovering the joy that is in Christ. This will light a fire like an unexpected force in your life. See, regardless of how you're feeling right now, you need to take a moment and assess what you have as being a follower of Jesus Christ, for those of you who are followers of Christ. One is that you have abounding grace in your life. Two is that you have unconditional and unlimited love from God. Also, we have access to the one who has given us life, and that he will use us for his purposes and be glorified in that. We have compassion unbounding, and also we have salvation for eternity. See, these are just the beginning of what we have been given in our relationship with Christ. We need to be preaching the gospel and understanding and realizing that regardless of how long you've been a Christian, you need to be able to take the time to be able to kind of feed the soul, as it were, reintroduce yourself to your Savior. And in so doing, what you're going to want to do is go out and share that with others. If you truly have come to accept Christ, all you should want to do then is share it. Share this beautiful free gift that's given to us with the others that are around us. And as Paul did, and Paul was able to see within the opportunities that were given to him in his imprisonment, he was able to take full advantage of those, be thankful, and be joyful in it. He saw every opportunity that was given to him. So what we need to do for ourselves is maybe take some time, as Paul would have done, and pray for the opportunities that come into our lives. Those people that might walk through the door, might knock on the door, that you might come in contact with when you do have opportunity of getting out of your house. Or maybe even over the internet that you'd be able to contact them. Maybe have that act of kindness and be able to take a meal over to your neighbor who might be doing it tough. Maybe write an actual physical letter to somebody. There's nothing like getting a letter in the post. I know everybody thinks it's easier just to do an email or send an SMS, but there's something special about receiving an actual physical letter in the post. Maybe you need to give a phone call to that relative you've been avoiding for years. There's so many different things that you can do, but not only doing the act, but actually saying something, talking with them, sharing what you have, that even though you're in isolation, that you have something so much better than anything anyone ever could have, and that is the gospel of Christ, that you are a follower of Jesus. See, my friends, you need to remember that isolation will not limit God and his message really getting out. How about being a part of that today? Maybe being a part of that this week. If you really want to experience joy during this time of isolation, get your mind off of yourself and consider how you can serve others by spreading the gospel. This is the very thing that Paul was trying to share with the Philippians. In his imprisonment, this gave him opportunities to be able to share the gospel with many that would have never heard the gospel themselves. He was able to talk to people in the palace. He was able to talk to people in the prison. He was able to talk to guards. He was able to talk to judiciary and so many other influential people during the time of his imprisonment. But what I really appreciated about it was that he also was an inspiration to others to be able to get out there and share their faith. It was a real reminder that we are not alone. Even though we feel like we might be in isolation, we are not alone. We may be limited physically, but that does not mean that we cannot be an inspiration for others to be able to get out and share their faith. This might be the ministry that you are meant to do at this time. Maybe you're meant to encourage others to also go out and share their faith. Take that time to be able to reach out to that missionary or that pastor that you've been wanting to do so for so long. Send a message or a call or write a letter to someone to encourage them. And not only just encourage them, but also pointing them to the gospel and encouraging them to share it if they know it. My friends, this is really what you can do during this time of isolation that could be similar to what Paul was able to show to the Philippian people. Well, finally, we kind of come down to the last point of this passage. And I find it kind of interesting that actually Paul would even bring this up. But it made sense once you kind of get the full context. It starts there in verse 15. It says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment." Now, this section kind of seems kind of strange. It seems kind of odd, as it were. But yet, it does make sense, is the sense that there are others out there proclaiming the gospel, but they're just doing it maybe for the wrong reasons. Now, this might be, some would say that this is our time to be able to kind of proclaim and be able to go out and find those that are doing things in the wrong manner. But I really think you might be missing the point of what Paul is really trying to express here. It reminded me when we first moved here to Australia, we visited numerous churches around the city. Interestingly enough, one thing stood out during that time. We heard numerous sermons that were less about preaching about the gospel and more about preaching about the methods of a large, successful church here in Sydney. To me, this is kind of counterproductive, preaching, personally. I mean, it was proving to inquirers or non-Christians that church is divided, or that also most of the talks came off as a bit of sour grapes or envy, instead of really just preaching the gospel and making sure that the good news was getting out. See, don't get me wrong, we should be studying the teachings of churches and authors and preachers to ensure that they really are aligned with the scriptures. I totally get that, and I appreciate it. But yet, is that what we should be doing as far as spending our time in the pulpit, railing against other churches, or should we be preaching the gospel? I think that's what Paul is really trying to get to here. Now, before I get into the trap myself and start talking about and railing against other churches, I really want to kind of make sure we stay in the text and see what Paul has to say about those who might be operating from less than reputable methods. Those who preach Christ from envy and rivalry are likely Christians who preach the gospel, but were at odds with Paul and his ministry. Yet he was thankful that the gospel was being preached, despite the negative implications of preaching it out of rivalry. He calls them out for what they are doing, but he does not allow that to kind of steal his joy. I also have to think that he was kind of smiling a bit and maybe have a bit of a glint in his eye or a wink. That he was saying, look, they may be doing it out of envy and rivalry, but guess what? The gospel is still going out. Jesus' name is still being proclaimed. God's message was not going to be deterred. God would be glorified in it all. And that's what I think really brings us to verse 18 and really kind of helps us to understand where we can find joy in that. It says, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. I find joy. See, this is not to minimize the less than reputable actions of others that are preaching the good news through envy or rivalry. No, really what Paul is trying to show us is his willingness to call people out, but yet, in the end, understanding that the gospel is still being preached. Despite these actions of other people, God is being praised. God is being glorified. And that no one was going to steal his joy, even while he was in prison, while he was in isolation. See, this letter was written by a man in isolation. Paul shows us that we can be joyful during that time. Why? Well, God has all of our lives worked out in his plan. And we need to really look for the opportunities God has given us today. Regardless of our physical limitations, God's message will get out there. And we need to see if we can be a part of that process. And finally, despite others preaching the gospel out of envy and rivalry, as he said, we can still take solace in the fact that God will be glorified in it, and we should be joyful because of it. Now, to all of us in isolation, I hope you can celebrate with me today as we look at Paul's example and find joy in lockdown. As we all look and kind of be able to see how we can be part of spreading the gospel during this very unique time in Australian history. Now I want to do something unique today. I'm going to show you a video. Now I know that's not unique for me, but what this video says is it kind of ties into the message in a way, but really what it's meant to do is for you to consider the life that you've been given and that you can be joyful in it. You can enjoy the ride. And we need to celebrate the life that we have, even in isolation, and especially if you're a follower of Christ, that you can find joy today. And what I want to encourage you to do, beyond just going and sharing the gospel with those that are around you and looking for the opportunities that you've been given today, is maybe go out and have some fun. Go do something with the family. Find a joyful moment where you'll be able to go through and celebrate together as one family. You might just have to do it in your own garden, or you might have to do it in the park across the street. But go out and find joy. And you never know. That might be the opportunity God has given you to be able to reach out to those that are around you. But if anything, what I'd hope you'd be able to do today is have some joy because of what God has given you in the life that you have.